Greetings and welcome to today's webinar from Real Story Group. Always one of our favorites of the year as we talk through the famous or perhaps infamous MarTech vendor subway map. We've got our CEO and founder, Tony Byrne, with us today to take us through that presentation. And my name is Scott Dill on the business development team here with Real Story Group. We expect this to be a fun 30 minutes together. And as always, we'll have time at the end for questions, feedback, or anecdotes you'd like to share. So feel free to enter those into the questions tab and the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to you at the end of today's session. These slides will be made available to you from our marketing team in the next couple of days as well. So keep an eye out for that, as we'll be sure to email those over to you. As we get started, just a couple quick high-level notes around Real Story Group. We've been at this for 25 years, and Tony will talk through the iterations of the map in that time. But one thing that certainly makes us unique is the way that we never work for technology vendors in any way, shape, or form. We sit on your side of the table, the buyer side of the table, to make sure that you're getting the right solution for your unique needs. And Tony will talk more about that. So I'll turn things over to him. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I share your enthusiasm for this. It's always an interesting exercise for us to redo this map, which we've been doing now for 17 years. The overall structure doesn't look that different from last year, or for that matter, the year before, although we've added a new line and changed some of the stations. But what's interesting is kind of what's going on underneath all of this. And it turns out there are some significant changes, some tectonic changes in the market, some enduring trends, and then there's some specific things about specific markets that are worth catching up on. One thing that I would say is that, this is the 2026 map. We tend not to be, purveyors of year by year trends. In other words, I can't guarantee that something is going to happen in 2026. We tend to look at more kind of longer term things and often more kind of 5-year cycles. So we definitely have some directional things to say. By making this the 2026 map doesn't mean that all the trends we're seeing are going to play out fully in 2026. Certainly there's a lot to say about things that are going to take probably several years to unfold. But as a MarTech leader, obviously you want to stay on top of that too. So let's jump into it. Always like to just set expectations about what the map is not, and then talk about what the map is actually suggesting overall. And then we'll spend about half our time today peeking into some specific markets where we have, I think, some unconventional wisdom to share. And then we'll wrap it up with some key takeaways for you, the enterprise MarTech leader. So it seems obvious, but we're saying this is not a stack diagram. We're not even suggesting that among these 10 different marketplaces that you need all of this software. Many of you are working just fine without some of these, traversing some of these lines. We do have a stack model that I'll share in a second, but this is really more a view of the marketplace, and more specifically the marketplaces, and where do technologies intersect with vendors. And so it's not a stack per se. We do have a reference architecture for the 2020s, which if you follow us, you've seen this many times, where we've got engagement channels at the top, interaction and delivery environments, engagement services, where many of us have been investing very heavily in the past really 20 years. And then this new tier down here that we've been talking about for the last 3-4 years of enterprise or customer foundation services. And our argument is that a lot of the energy is moving there, and you'll see how that kind of plays out with respect to the map and some of the things that are happening within those markets. But this is more of a reference architecture. When we work with individual corporate members and clients, we always end up kind of shaping this more specifically to their environment, but this is more of a generic reference model for what a stack might look like. So it's a somewhat different picture, different metaphor really than the subway. The other thing to point out is that, of course, not all these vendors are equal. Some have more lines going through them. That is not necessarily a value judgment in their favor. In fact, we'll see in a minute, it may be actually somewhat in their disfavor. So we're not saying that one is better than the other here. We do have opinions on that particular topic. These we believe are educated opinions about which vendors fit particular use cases. So, you saw this on the first screen. If we look at journey orchestration and some of the things, multi-channel marketing and some of the things that you'll see in traditional analyst firms, you'll see Adobe way out on top. But that's more of a generic kind of leaderboard. And on the other hand, if we look at our own Real Story Group's Real Quadrant, we can put together a series of use cases here where Adobe is actually back in the losers column. So the point here really is not so much to diss on Adobe or not, but more that, there are ways of evaluating vendors. You need to evaluate them in context according to fit for your specific needs. So we tend to be anti-quadrant in as much as these quadrants are static. Those of you who are subscribers know that you can use our Real Quadrant tool to develop a more contextualized, dynamic view of the market as the vendors relate specifically to you, which is something we don't do in the overall subway map. So that was just a couple of caveats there. Now, let's turn and look at what are some general trends that are happening overall. And some of these are evergreen trends. In other words, it was that way 20 years ago, might still be this way 20 years from now. And then some are a little bit more contextual. In other words, they're sort of more recent kind of thing. So the first thing that has always been the case in this market, really since the beginning, is these markets are what analysts call highly fragmented marketplaces. So fragmented means in analyst speak that there's a hell of a lot of vendors to choose from in really all of these marketplaces, with the possible exception of the omni-channel content platforms, which is really an emerging market that we'll talk about in a minute, the red line. But the other 9, they're highly competitive marketplaces. And I think even more so with the rise of SaaS, that the startup costs and the provisioning costs for a vendor, the barriers to entry have become all that much lower. There's a path to profitability with the SaaS model, so you don't see as many vendors going away, quite frankly. We'll talk about a few in a second, but this has always been a good thing for you. I think it's been a good thing for the market, that it has provided innovation pressure, it's provided pricing pressure, it has presented you with a lot of different choices, architecturally, regionally, size-wise, all sorts of things. So it's quite unlike, for example, like the ERP market, which is highly consolidated. And by the way, every year you'll see on LinkedIn all kinds of pundits, some who should really know better, who will talk about consolidation. That there's going to be consolidation, this market's going to disappear, this has become a commodity, so on and so forth. Now, there are some marketplaces in decline. I'll talk about that in a minute, but this consolidation almost never happens. Very few vendors actually leave this map relative to vendors coming on the map. So it's a highly fragmented marketplace. You have a lot of choices that sometimes feels overwhelming, but in general, this has been, to your benefit. So again, this has always been fragmented. This is just a quick animated GIF showing the evolution of this map over the years. And there's a couple of things you can see here, which is there's always been this vibrant periphery of a lot of different vendors. Some of the markets have evolved and changed, so this isn't a static environment. But one thing that's also been true is there's always been like this city center, right? And so from MarTech, you've got Salesforce and Adobe, certainly Oracle and Microsoft to a lesser degree, SAP in there to some extent, and then there's some others off to the side. Out in the periphery, you have some subway lines joining for the likes of Sitecore and Acquia and others. The city center, again, we're not making a value judgment about these vendors. If anything, the fact that they have a number of different lines running through them, most of our subscribers would say most of the time this ends up being kind of a demerit, actually, is that a lot of these have been accumulated through acquisitions, aren't particularly well integrated, and that the vendor itself it creates some risks by putting all of these eggs in one basket. But having said that, there has always been this city center of major suite vendors and their argument, which is really often more an argument for your executives, is that you can reduce your risks and consolidate your platforms by going with a single vendor, which is a very attractive story. Turns out it's almost always an inaccurate story, but you can understand the appeal of it. And so that there's always been this notion of like a city center, that you would find some safety here. And certainly these are the vendors that are very good at analyst relations. And so that's why they tend to be treated as much more vibrant in traditional Forrester and Gartner quadrants than they are in real life. In real life, what's happened is that the composable stack model has definitely won. So this is really more the case, we would say, at the enterprise tier and the upper mid-market, where if we look at, we've surveyed on an ongoing basis 30 large global enterprises that are corporate members and belong to our council. And we said, okay, what are you using for these different boxes? And yeah, you see some Adobe and Salesforce, a little bit of Oracle and SAP here and there, but it's a wide variety. In fact, this doesn't even account for, that we did this a couple of years ago, it doesn't account for all. If we redid this now, we would see even more, right? So the composable model has really won in this, and I can think of only one, maybe two large enterprises that have really gone all in with a single vendor for their stack, and usually there was a particular reason why they did that. But the composable model has won at a stack level. Now, should you be composable within an individual box is another question. In other words, should you have a composable web content management system? Should you have a composable customer data environment? That sort of thing. That's a separate question. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But at a stack level, the composable model has won, and that's why, among other reasons, that subway map is very crowded and will continue to be very crowded. That's what you, the buyer, want, and that's where you're seeing best results. So that's what's happening overall. A couple points that I wanted to make here. One is that, we don't pretend that the different lines in that map represent a full universe of all the potential vendors in that marketplace. I think you can look at Scott Brinker's famous charts, logo charts, which tell you the whole universe of all the possible email marketing vendors and all the possible personalization vendors. These are the ones that come up due to inquiries from our enterprise customer base. So these are the ones that we would argue tend to matter the most, or at least matter the most for the mid-sized to large enterprises that we work with. So again, we're not suggesting that this is a comprehensive list, but that these are the most important vendors in each one of these marketplaces. The other thing I want to just remind you is that if you have any questions or comments or anything you disagree with, feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. We've got a lot of people online today, so we can't unmute you and have a conversation. But again, if there's something you agree with, or even if there's something you disagree with, or an anecdote you want to share, feel free to use that, and we'll check in before the end of the half hour here. Okay, so that's what's happening overall. Now let's peek into some specific markets where, as always, there's interesting things happening, and this is where we've made, the most significant changes. So first, of course, we have to talk about AI. Last year, we added the green line, which was AI for marketing, came up with 16 different use cases to evaluate these vendors. Very interesting that some appear to be more amenable to marketing use cases than others. Took the same approach with this new purple line for agentic for marketing. So there's a couple interesting things to say here. One is what we call the core AI, which are those vendors that specialize in things like Gen AI, Insights AI, Decisioning AI. We now call them core AI vendors. And agentic AI vendors are mostly different. So that's really interesting right there. And so the key insight here is that agentic AI technology really builds off core AI technology. It's not a leapfrog beyond. So you really have to mature your core AI capabilities, and not just in Gen AI, to really be able to leverage agents. And I think that's one of the big takeaways of certainly the second half of this year, where we've been working with a number of enterprises on their agentic strategies. The second thing is that even more so than the green line, the purple line here around agentic technology is very much a development play. That it's very easy to prototype an AI agent. It is very, very difficult to put one into production, particularly if it is a cross-platform agent and what we call orchestration agents, and those are the highest value ones. Then the final thing that we're really saying here is that, look, across all 10 of these markets, every station, every vendor is going to say they're an AI vendor. They're going to say that they're AI native, that they're AI first, that they're AI this, AI that. The smart enterprises are making AI, including agentic AI, more of a layer in their stack rather than lighting it up willy-nilly across all of these different silos. And particularly if you're a large enterprise, that's what we'll encourage for you. Got a lot of background material on that, a lot of background on agents. Just published something yesterday on LinkedIn you can check out. A lot to say here, but clearly agentic is here, and agentic is yet another line on the subway map. So that's super interesting to us. And I think it's going to be very meaningful for you going forward. Again, you should look at Insights AI, Decisioning in AI as a layer in your stack. There are specific use cases. Some vendors are going to be better at certain use cases. And more importantly, some of you are going to benefit more or less from different use cases. So it's so important to suss that out. Agent AI, in addition to bifurcating between workflow automation and stack orchestration, which are two different things, also has its own set of 9 use cases that are very interesting because different vendors specialize. But the other key insight from this platform, in addition to the evergreen requirement here on the right that you invoke responsible AI and that needs to be done at an enterprise level, but also this notion of foundational platforms, customer data stores, orchestration engines, what we call an omni-channel content platform. They were really important for omni-channel coherence. Already smart customers were making investments there. Now in the age of AI, they're almost essential. And so a lot of the conversations we're having with you all is about how to get there, how to build some of these foundational platforms in a way that you can really take advantage of the benefits of AI, and then by extension, the benefits of agents. Okay, let's talk about a couple of other platforms, possibly the 2 oldest, definitely the 2 oldest platforms on the subway map. And it's so interesting to us, having followed these technologies for really a quarter of a century now, what's happening here. And to understand what's happening here, we need to put it in context. So I'm talking about web CMS, sometimes called Web Content and Experience Management, or WCM, and outbound marketing platforms. So on the B2C side, those are ESP, or email service providers. On the B2B side, they're maps or marketing automation platforms. And our argument here is that both of these marketplaces are shrinking. So by shrinking, it's not that necessarily vendors are going away, although that is happening, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but more that they're kind of losing their centrality in your stack, and a lot of these vendors are really plateauing in the marketplace. And what's interesting is some of them are going more down market, which is very interesting. And why is that? What's going on? And it come back again to this notion of enterprise or customer foundation services, and where that's a lot of the energy is going there, because this is the only way really of going forward and doing effective, coherent, efficient customer engagement for the second half of this decade, is to really invest to decouple these core services from your engagement tier. And so the good news is, as a result, your engagement tier can get lighter. We're definitely seeing that in loyalty, where customers had a lot of logic and data tied up in loyalty platforms, and now they're trying to decouple. Happening to some extent in social media management, definitely happening in e-commerce, where now a lot of the motion and energy around e-commerce is just to have essentially a headless, front-end transactional environment, and all this logic and data and content living behind that in core platforms. And this is happening in outbound marketing and WCM a little bit more slowly, but I think what's happening is that both of those mediums are, of course, very mature, outbound and inbound. And what's happening is that they are becoming relatively less important in your stack. It's not that they're becoming unimportant, it's just they're becoming relatively less important relative to all the other touch points. And that the vision here is that it doesn't make a lot of sense to push a lot more capability into those channels when they are just individual silos. And what you really want to do is to be able to leverage your content, your data, and your logic across all these different channels. And so this is an opportunity to get lighter at the engagement tier. Enterprises are starting to do this. Some enterprises that we've worked with have been very aggressive here and have saved literally millions of dollars on this. But what's happening is that those lines are also getting shorter because there's fewer and fewer vendors that really are adept at this new world. Certainly that's happening on the WCM side. In terms of outbound marketing, a number of the vendors are reinventing themselves as so-called CEPs, or customer engagement platforms, where they're trying to be a MarTech stack in a box for mid-market firms, which is fine. Many mid-market firms, and there's billions of them in the world, need that kind of stack in a box. That's great, but that doesn't mean that necessarily that vendor is going to work anymore as an enterprise ESP for you. And I think more generally, we're rethinking, outbound marketing. The actual delivery of the messages is becoming a commodity. So really what you're paying for is kind of a campaign environment and an authoring environment. And should you really be managing your campaigns and authoring in that environment is a question that certainly a lot of enterprises are asking themselves. The other thing too is that in these two spaces is where we see a lot of zombie vendors. So very happy that this year we've gotten rid of a number of zombie vendors from the subway map, including Unica, HCL, Acoustic, OpenText, Media Beacon. Look, they were there because there were some people still lingering in those environments, but you would never license them afresh. In our podcast, we had a whole episode about zombie vendors. You can scan the QR code to go to the full list of podcasts there. We were poking a little fun, but it's also a serious issue that you want to keep those zombie vendors definitely contained in your stack. And you tend to see them more in some subway lines than others. CDPs, we do a lot on CDPs and always have. You can see a number of recorded webinars that we've done there. I'm not going to go into great detail except that this year you had all these pundits saying that CDPs are dead, we don't need them anymore. I tend to think we tend to think that's not true. That what's happened is that there's been an evolution of our understanding of what we need to do on the customer data side, that we definitely need a customer data fabric of some kind where you've got a customer 360 that's probably run by your data ops team, but then you still need some environment or environments where ideally marketing and digital people can leverage that data. And so the question is, what does that look like? And in many cases, it's still going to be a CDP, right? That's a more marketing oriented platform. A lot of choices out here. Some of these vendors will still probably get acquired. Some may become insignificant. Generally, we tend to tell you to avoid some of the sweet vendors, but obviously a longer conversation to be had here. But I think rumors of the death of CDP, much exaggerated. They're going to be around. It's just that we may end up calling them different things, and the market was always going to fragment like this because when people say CDPs, they mean a lot of different things. So we're trying to group them into ways that hopefully make more sense. Digital asset management and its new child, omni-channel content platforms. So interesting, so important. Digital asset management started out really as a standalone library and then a connected service. And the vendors there really supported what we call DAM 1.0 and DAM 2.0. And this was really about managing files, and it was really around managing image and video files. And the reality is that your content assets are much more than those files, right? So if we think about the word asset and we decouple that term from image assets or video assets, and we think about what's an asset, which is some component that's worth saving, worth managing, worth propagating, then we also need to consider narrative components and also data that's masquerading as content. And for that, you really need an omni-channel content platform, which is getting you to what we call DAM 3.0. And DAM 3.0 has all kinds of benefits in and of itself. We think it's the only way to scale. It's the only way to do omni-channel, but it's also really the only way to confront the potential and really realize the potential benefits of AI. That if you're doing AI within specific channels, you're doing it wrong. This needs to be done in an omni-channel way. And this is a precondition for then going to what we call DAM 4.0. Nobody's there yet, but we're all going to want to get there. And that's really much more about satisfying the demand chain for content as opposed to the supply chain. There's a lot to talk about here. Again, we've got webinars you can see about this, but I think this is one of the most important conversations that we're having with our corporate members is this sort of rethink of asset management, decoupling the term from this traditional kind of DAM marketplace and thinking about what it means in a content-fueled future world. And it's very different than the world is right now. And so that's why we continue to have two separate marketplaces here. Okay. Let's wrap up with some key takeaways, and then we will entertain any questions or comments you have. We are living in turbulent times, whether we like it or not, turbulent politically, turbulent economically, turbulent socially, all over the world. And then of course there's AI. And one of the things that we've noticed about AI and agents is that among the MarTech leaders, we know it initially tended to invoke a kind of a paralysis, like, oh my God, this is, what does this mean? We have to wait and see what this means. And I think that, there's definitely value in pausing before you adopt too quickly, but strategic paralysis is a decision in and of itself. You're deciding not to decide. And so we're trying to say, look, paralysis is not your friend, that there's still strong decisions you can make in turbulent times, particularly around some of the foundational investments that need to be made. The other takeaway, which was just as true 20 years ago and still will be true, I think 10 years from now, is to build a composable stack, and that you want to avoid sweep plays. Again, you can look at our podcasts and help you deal. I know that many of you know this, but your executives don't know this. And so there's ways that you can fight back against some of the bullying that some of the vendors will do by going above your head to your executives. You have many choices. These are highly fragmented marketplace. And so the key is not who's winning, who's losing, but what's the best fitting platform for your enterprise. And this is something obviously we can help you with. Remain thoughtful about how you bring in AI. So a bunch of disconnected tactical pilots is not a strategy. I think it's really critical to have a strategy, and we can, I think, give you a uniquely independent take on what's really working out there. So happy to entertain your inquiries there. One of the things we know is that you're going to have to rethink asset management, really rethink content management in the era of AI. And this notion of DAM 3.0, which gets beyond these binary image files and really thinks about your content assets in a more enterprise context, in a customer consumption context. That's going from what we would have said for the last 5 years as nice to have to becoming must have. Now, I say that, and I don't want to be like one of those jerks who says, well, you have to do this, you have to do that, or you're going to fall behind, because going to DAM 3.0 is really hard. It's hard organizationally. It requires new skills. It requires investment in certain areas. It gives you the benefit of reducing your level of effort in other areas, but it's a big deal. I'm not going to soft pedal that, but it's a big deal you ought to be thinking about and moving towards. And there is a roadmap of going there that's not like, some massive overnight change. And then finally, there's this great opportunity that you have to downshift your web CMS and outbound marketing investments, and do this really in a modernization context where those two tiers become less decision makers and more order takers, and you free up the resources there to really be able to connect better with your customers in an omni-channel way wherever they're showing up. And you know that they're going to be already showing up through chatbots and to some extent consumer agents. Consumer agents are going to proliferate much faster than enterprise agents. And so to adapt to that world, your web content management system, marketing platform, I'm not going to have a whole lot to say about that, whatever your vendors tell you. So this is really not just an opportunity, but at some level, a mandate to downshift your investments at the engagement tier to preserve those resources for being able to address all these new forms of customer interaction that are happening. So that's what this map is telling us, certainly open to your reactions, your feedback, and your questions. Wanted to just remind you that Real Story Group can help you in various ways, can help you tune your AI strategy, certainly your DAM strategy, your WCM strategy, whatever strategy you have, either within a particular subway line or across them, in terms with respect to optimizing your stack. That's what we're here for. That's what we live for. We only sit on your side of the table. We only want to help you, the MarTech leader. Everything else is a non-issue for us. We're just on your side of the table. But speaking of tables, the other thing that we offer our corporate members is availability and access to our exclusive council. It's only enterprise leaders, and we get together privately once a year in person, 3 times a year online, and let our hair down, share notes, fascinating discussions. We just talked about and did some polling and surveying around agentic AI just a couple of weeks ago. Super interesting. So if you're interested in learning from your peers, please let Scott know. And so Scott, I'll turn it over to you while we take a look at any questions or comments. And once again, you can put those in the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And if you'd like to take a look at what we have to say on any of these particular lines on the subway map, you can always take a look at samples of our research, but also we have a few recorded webinars on our site that address DAM, AI, modernizing your MarTech selection process. So certainly recommend taking a look at those. And if you're interested in joining our next live presentation, that'll be just after the holiday season on January 8th. We'll look at potentially replacing your ESP and marketing automation system. So stay tuned for that. And as Tony mentioned, we do have a couple minutes here for questions. I do see one from Sarah. Tony, do you see that one as well?
I don't. Could you just read that one out loud, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sarah is asking if there are any distinctions for B2B versus B2C here.
Yeah, it's interesting because we don't make that distinction on the map. It's one of many things that we decided not to sort of weave into the cartography, Sarah. There are some distinctions in the marketplace. So you saw, for example, in outbound marketing, we make a very bold distinction between B2C ESPs versus B2B maps, or certainly in the CDP marketplace, B2B has been a little bit of the unloved stepchild, I would say. The same issues arise from an overall stack perspective, but the nature, obviously, of go-to-market makes things a little bit different. I would say that in general, B2B tools, because the market is a little bit smaller, the B2B marketing tools tend to have a narrower set of choices overall. We also see a little bit more of a desire in the B2B, particularly in the small and mid-sized market, to have this kind of stack in a box type thing, which I totally get, rather than a more composable stack. What we have seen among our own membership is more and more business model shifting, even among, and especially among larger enterprises, where B2Bs are trying to connect more with their end customers, and B2Cs are trying to weave in some B2B and distribution models. So this notion of, you have hybrid B2B and B2C companies, you have B2B to C companies, these lines can get a little bit blurry, but certainly when it comes to the go-to-market, it can be very distinct. And the big issue, of course, is there a salesperson in the middle? But the great question. Is there a DAM more friendly than others to agentic development, provided you have internal developers? I'm going to say probably not, Stephen. I mean, what you would need, there's a couple of issues here. One is, are you trying to build an agent that just works within the DAM, or are you trying to connect that DAM to other platforms? So if you're trying to connect that DAM to other platforms, that's going to be a very heavy lift no matter what. Just because of the nature of orchestration agents. If you're talking about a task agent that just works within the platform, there's a good chance that your DAM vendor is already sort of lighting some of those up, and you'll obviously want to test those very carefully against your enterprise considerations. The thing that we would look for if you're building agents from scratch, of course, is the robustness of the API, and then the robustness of the underlying AI services that you're trying to leverage with that agent. And that latter one is really critical. Like, we've seen some really impressive agents that are working on top of some really shitty AI routines with insufficient context, delivering, really bad results. So the quality of the underlying AI mechanisms is going to be a really important consideration for you. Okay, with that, I see we've already gone 5 minutes over. Sorry for that, but always an exciting time, a fascinating topic, and glad to be able to spend some time with you. So for Scott Dill and the rest of the Real Story Group team, this is Tony Byrne signing off for now. See you next time.